Morning all. Give people a couple of minutes to show up and do the housekeeping shite. What's going on? It's October, which for me means Schlocktoberfest, which means I basically rapidly put out a whole bunch of not particularly polished stuff, just kind of ideas and nonsense and so on, throw it up for sale. So if that tickles your fancy for whatever reason, then you can get hold of that on DriveThru or on my own site, post-mort.com. Still trying to build this channel. This is not the same channel as my regular channel, so subscribe. I need enough subscribers that I can give the channel a proper name, so I need to get 100 or so people, I believe, subscribed here before I can do that, so that would be nice if you feel so inclined. The news today, yeah, it's the usual sort of stuff. Let me just check whether the chat is working. Is that going to come up? Yes, it is. Okay, because I just had to update OBS and everything was a little bit thrown off. What else is going on? Not a lot. The SLA Industries Kickstarter is getting to its end. Good game, good guys, despite having fallen out with them a bit. So, yeah, if that tickles your fancy, a kind of post-cyberpunk, very corporately critical RPG about hyper-consumerism and violence, then, you know, that's one to back. And I know it'll be a good product. And Dave Alsop, I still consider him a mate. And he's a fantastic artist. He's worked for a load of different people, so well worth your backing there. Right, rather than continuing to waffle and fook about, let's see what's in the news. And I haven't organised it this morning, so it's going to be a mishmash. Any comments or questions? Please fire them off towards the end. If you want to reshare the programme so we get more people in, that'd be great, because I'm still trying to build this channel up to rival my other one. Okay, so mental health issues in the UK. Understandably, this is something of a concern for me, something that I worry about a lot, something that I've experienced and been through firsthand. And this is one of the areas in which I would admit that the National Health Service fails in the UK, and it pains me to say so, and I understand why. All right, the NHS is set up on the basis of a triage system, so the more you need something, the higher you go up the list, right? The faster you get seen to, and so on. It's done on the basis of need, not on the basis of the weight of your wallet, if you will. Though we do have a concurrent private healthcare system, so if you are rich, you can jump the queue if you want to. But since that just opens up spaces for other people within the NHS, I find it hard to complain too much about that. And the NHS pushes down the prices of private healthcare plans to the point where they're affordable even for people like me. I just don't have one on principle. I used to. But when it comes to mental health care goes on for a long time. There's not really some kind of magical cure that you can get, right? It goes on forever. It's expensive. These are things that make it extra difficult for the NHS to really cope with dealing with people. But there's been a lot of talk about higher amounts of investment, more money for this particular set of issues. Hasn't really come through yet, but they're already running into problems. There's a whole bunch of vacancies for psychiatrists. Now, when I put in for help, it was going to be something like 6 months before I got to see a psychiatrist. It was going to be 3 months before I could see a counsellor, which I did, but CBT is not particularly useful. That's cognitive behavioral therapy, not cock and ball torture, right? Before you get any ideas. But then I had a suicide attempt, and that bumped me to the top of the list. So yeah, that's how triage works. Yeah, and how it's supposed to. But we were already having to wait months and months and months to see a psychiatrist, and then you really only got like one, maybe two appointments every 3 to 6 months. It was mostly just assessment, and because they're specialists, they could give you prescriptions for different drugs and so on, and have a better idea, a better handle on how to cope with your treatment. But there's a whole bunch of vacancies which we can't fill for psychiatrists. So if you're talking about pumping more money into the system, that's great, but the waiting lists and so on aren't going to go down unless you can employ additional psychiatrists, right? And they haven't been able to fill the spaces that they do have. So the number of empty spaces for psychiatrists within the NHS has doubled in the last 6 years. And this is especially true of children's services, which is going to tie into another story that's been making the rounds today. 1 in 10 consultant posts for psychiatrists is vacant. That's it's nearly 600 out of nearly 6,000 places. I think let me actually find the exact figures, just to pretend I'm competent first thing in the morning. 568 places out of 5,730 places is vacant, up from 1 in 20 in 2013. This is after a census by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and it's particularly on the children's services end. Some of this is probably due to there being a lot more money in private practice of psychiatry and a lot more money in the treatment of adults in psychiatry. Doctors we don't generally have too much of a problem with, though Brexit's going to scupper that, because I think people get into that more out of a sense of duty and care for the community, whereas mental health, probably because we don't really have that many definitive answers in that field, seems to attract people who want money a bit more. That's probably a bit unfair. I've known some very nice and publicly minded psychiatrists, but maybe it's a bit less common. And junior doctors don't see as much prestige in that, and they worry whether they're good enough to do it. Seems to be one issue. And this just it all goes back to this shortage. We're not getting enough doctors. We're not getting enough mental health professionals. And if Brexit goes ahead at the end of this week, and it's as horrible a crash out Brexit as is being suggested, then that just becomes even more of a problem, because a lot of the medical professionals that we do bring in are from Europe, to make up the shortfall. My first psychiatrist was Polish, a rather hot Polish woman with very distracting legs. So that was interesting. Maybe I wasn't concentrating as much as I should have. Second one was British, but very young. So there are some junior doctors and so on coming through, but as with all other NHS staffing, a lot of it comes from abroad. And so we're making a rod for our own backs, really, lately, but we'll come back to that, I'm sure. This confused me, this next story. So there's an in vitro fertilization bill making its way through the French political system. So fertility treatment, right? And yet it's caused protests by thousands of people in Paris. Separately to the yellow vest thing, which still rumbles on at a relatively low level. But large crowds have taken to the streets in Paris to oppose this bill that would provide IVF treatment to single women and lesbian couples. I'm having a hard time understanding why. Now, possibly because Catholicism was always stronger on the continent and stronger in France, despite the French Revolution. I'm thinking maybe that's something to do with it. The shtick of the show. I just grab things that look interesting from the headlines and then react to them. It's like a satire on people who react and comment online, right? So I have no real clue. I'm guessing it's because of Catholicism. So this would be, France has already legalized gay marriage in 2013. They're usually pretty progressive and scientifically minded, a legacy of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and all the rest, in which France was a bit of a leader, despite chopping a lot of people's heads off. But why is this protest here? One said that 74,000 attended, while the organisers said about 500,000 people attended. A protest to deny people fertility treatment. And I'm guessing a lot of these people are quite conservative. Conservatives traditionally are worried about birth rates, and surely the provision of IVF would be something that would get those birth rates up. But here's the meat of it. Okay. Political and religious conservatives want the bill scrapped. Okay, I think they're a bit confused, and I don't think this is something that is particularly any of their business. I guess it's about defending the traditional family, but yeah, there's a certain stereotype about the French having lots of affairs, which has been accurate in my limited anecdotal experience. So I guess that's what the problem is. But they're definitely a minority in terms of the French people. At least that's what the polling suggests, that traditional family structures are dissolving. Of course, the one man, one woman and kids family structure isn't actually that traditional when you think about it. The whole takes a village to raise a child thing is very true, and traditional family structures have tended to be polygamous. The genetic evidence suggests that in the past, it tended to be one man with multiple women, sometimes lots. Genghis Khan, I'm looking at you. And that kids were raised more by the tribe and the extended family, the kin group, rather than a couple. So the idea of the couple as being the traditional set family type is actually quite new in historical terms. And also then you have to take into account that marriages used to be political, and so affairs and so on were much more acceptable. Children born out of wedlock were much more acceptable in the past. So this whole construct, this idea of the traditional family, is not really that old at all. I'm guessing, really, it's only really been codified and held since post Enlightenment, probably post 18th century, really. I mean, when it came to kings and queens and so on, you wanted to be sure of the lineage of whoever was going to be next in line for the throne. But the peasants, they could just fucking get on with it as much as they wanted, really, and nobody gave too much of a damn. So, traditional marriage is one man, the corpses of several other men, and a lot of women, in realistic genetic terms. But hey, people are gonna be stupid regardless. So back to the mental health thing. It's not just the health system that's under strain because of that. The education system, which, like the health system, has been starved of funding for quite a long time due to austerity, because of that, there's a shortage of special needs provision. So kids with mental problems, behavioural problems, developmental problems, learning issues, all of that kind of thing. There's a shortage there too. And again, teaching, education, a lot of that recruitment tends to come from abroad as well. Less so because you need to have a really good command of English, but we're lazy because the rest of the world bothers to learn English, which these days is because of the Americans. But there you go. So there's been a huge spike of complaints in the last few years. In the last reporting period, so 2018 to 2019, there was another spike of complaints. And of those complaints against the educational system for not providing properly for special needs students, 9 out of 10 complaints were upheld. Which kind of reminds me of my own tribunal thing that I had to go to get my health assistance and so on for my mental health problems. At one level, they're paid to reject people. At another, once you get to tribunal, which is truly independent, the majority of appeals are upheld. So it seems like a similar thing is going on here. And the government's planning more money, but that's for education in general, not necessarily for people with kids with issues. And if we're failing them, that can drag down the whole school, and it does have a really big knock-on effect, particularly for these kids later on in life. If they're unable to get those basic skills at school, their outcomes tend to be quite bad. And if you're a fiscal conservative, bear in mind that if we don't invest when they're kids and get them to a basic level of competence, make them employable, make them contributors to society, then they're more likely to become drains on society for the much longer period when they're not in school, right? And they should be seeking some kind of employment or whatever. So if you're, oh my God, we can't spend money paying to educate poor people, keep in mind it'll cost more in the long run if you don't, right? The same way that national healthcare system, socialised healthcare, is cheaper for everybody, even you, right? Keep these things in mind. Normally I leave Brexit stuff to the end, but not today. It's all intermixed because I'm in a little bit of a hurry. So the first bit of Brexit news today, Macron, President of France, has come out and said that an EU Brexit deal decision should be in place by the end of the week. Now, whether this is just tough talk to apply pressure and so on for the last minute negotiations or what, isn't clear, but the EU is going to decide whether Johnson's proposals and so on have any legs whatsoever by the end of the week. And so far it doesn't look like there is much chance of any kind of resolution to any of this, because Boris's plans are not very good and are almost definitely going to lead to violence again in Northern Ireland. We've already seen an uptick lately. It's not necessarily made the international news, but there have been incidents already. And we're looking at a hard border or a hard-ish border with border checks back from the border for goods and so on flowing between what would then be the EU and the United Kingdom. And that brings back a lot of memories for people of barbed wire and helicopters and British troops on the border, and those border posts being popular targets for the IRA, who in various continuity groups have been ongoing. So if it doesn't please France and it doesn't please Ireland, which Bojo's plans don't, then it's extremely unlikely that the EU are going to agree to any sort of deal with him. So it's Britain that needs to move on these negotiations. And that doesn't seem particularly likely. Bojo is being very, very bombastic about the whole thing. If he can be forced to call for an extension, and if Brexit of one sort or another hasn't happened by the 31st, so Halloween, appropriate timing, then the electoral fortunes of the Conservative Party look pretty terrible, because their votes will end up being split between them and the Brexit Party. And there's a pact between the minority parties on the other side, apart from Labour, twats, that could do pretty well. So in that instance, if Bojo goes back on his steadfast, I'd rather be dead in a ditch promise to leave the EU by the 31st, then the Conservatives are in a lot of trouble. Weirdly, their popularity is remaining pretty high at the moment. I attribute that to the incompetence and self-serving nature of the opposition more than the steadfastness or whatever of Bojo. Now, there is a hard third of the population, or the voting population at least, that really does want a Brexit. They can't articulate why, they don't seem to understand the damage that it'll do, but there is a hardcore of about 1 in 3 people in the country that still want a hard Brexit. That's probably what's shoring up the Conservative support. I don't think a general election would solve anything, because a general election is about multiple issues, not just one issue, and if you make it about one issue, the party, whichever one gets in, is going to take it as an endorsement of all their views, which isn't true. I think we need a second referendum. I don't see any way around that. An extension, a second referendum. You could have a referendum and an election at the same time. and hopefully one way or the other that would sort things out. But I think we just need to repeal and revisit the issue in 5 years, which I think is the minimum waiting time, and have another referendum then. That's what I would do. The global economy is not looking very good. We could be staring down the barrel of another crash and another Great Depression. And in those circumstances, it makes even more sense to be part of the EU and to be sheltered and protected somewhat from that. And then revisit the issue later on when we have some time to sort things out. Of course, it's illegal at the moment to go for a no-deal Brexit, but no legislation can bind a future parliament, which may be why Bojo's been playing up the proroguing. Now, they've made this law, but I don't think it can be binding to the next parliament. That's why he wants a Queen's speech, I think, because that would close this parliament and open another one. We may see some attempts today to hold a vote of no confidence and set up a government of national unity, but I don't think the odds are particularly good of that going through. Oh, what a mess. What a fucking mess. Speaking of Bojo, so more and more questions about his relationship with Jennifer Arcuri, who looks like a kind of stunned naked mole rat in a wig to me. Not to insult someone's appearance, but yeah. She's a bit of a money grubber, must be said. She's been bandying about the papers and various other news sources, offering to sell the story of her relationship with Boris Johnson for about $200,000, I think. Or was it? It's either $200,000 or £200,000. But thanks to Brexit, there's not that much of a difference between the two, so it doesn't really matter so much. She still hasn't revealed any details, so she's clearly holding out to being paid before she says anything more about it. Boris has been called Bonking Boris for some time because of things. Personally, I do not think that this has any bearing whatsoever on his ability as a political leader. You know, it's someone fucking around. Who cares? It's got nothing to do with anything. Didn't care about it when it was Clinton. Didn't even care about it when it was David Mellor. If you're old enough to remember that, fucking in his Arsenal or West Ham kit? I can never remember. I'm not a football fan, but yeah, I mean, who cares? Are they competent as a politician? Bojo, well, he's competent as a politician in the sense that he'll backstab anybody to get ahead, but is he competent as a leader of the country or as a politician in any other way? No, it's just a vain narcissist in the Trumpian mould, albeit one that can quote Latin and read, you know. So, bit better than Boris, a bit better than Trump, but that hurts me to say so. But frankly, I don't care about this. I don't think any of Boris's supporters care. They're probably more likely to be like, "Work on, my son, get in there," sort of people. So I just don't see the point in pursuing this story. Then that's my hot take on the whole thing, I guess. Knife crime in London. Of course, we've got lots of stories on this. I've reported on it before, but I keep hearing people say, "Oh, London is so violent." You know, there's so many. You'd think, right? You step out the door to get your newspaper off the doormat or whatever, and you get stabbed. It's not how it is. There's an old joke, right, about Scotland. In Glasgow, they can't afford cars or guns, so you get run by slashings. So, you can get guns in the UK. It's just hyper expensive, and law enforcement and sentencing and so on comes down on you hugely hard just for like being in the vicinity of a gun, pretty much. And I wouldn't have it any other way, and I'd rather be stabbed than shot any day of the week, thank you. But there has been a very high rise in terms of percentages, but if you look at the actual numbers of incidents, right, because violent crime and so on is so low in the UK compared to other places, even a very small rise in individual incidents appears to be a huge rise in terms of percentages. Like, imagine in my local town, right, we had 1 stabbing last year and 2 stabbings this year, right? The papers could legitimately have screaming headlines saying, "Knife crime in Andover doubles in a year," right? And that would be accurate, but it doesn't reflect the reality. So people saying that London is the most violent city, blah blah blah. Oh look, even without guns, it's terrible. You got to keep in mind the population density, the actual number of incidents, and so on, and recording differences. Now I don't know if this is still the same, but if say 5 guys jumped one guy in an alleyway, right, and one of those guys stabbed him, that would get reported as 5 or 6 different violent crime incidents under the rules that they were reporting crime on a few years ago, right? So that's actually, it's one incident, but it ends up recorded 5 or 6 times, depending. So that's the other thing you've got to keep in mind. The statistics end up being inflated. So if you're going to point to London knife crime and violent crime as an excuse for you owning guns or whatever, I strongly suggest that you take a long hard look at the actual statistics. Okay, there might be a table here with some useful information. Okay, here's a table from regional police forces in England and Wales. That's the other thing you have to keep in mind about British crime statistics. Scotland tends to be recorded separately because they have their own separate legal system and so on. So in 2014, England and Wales recorded just over 20,000 knife crimes in the year. That's across the whole of England and Wales. 4 years later, it's roughly double that. Okay, but then you've got to remember, keep in mind the incidence rate and the recording methods and so on. So keep all that in mind when you're trying to compare apples and oranges, because that's not actually that many, considering the timescale and the population, right? Okay, worrying news from Trump in the Middle East. Who's surprised? Anyone? Bueller? Okay, for the longest time, the West has supported the Kurds. They're a more liberal-minded ethnic Arab group, swamp Arabs they get called in some places. And it's an ethnic group that crosses borders. So there's Kurds in Iraq, there's Kurds in Turkey. It's an issue. The West has traditionally backed them because they tend to be anti-Taliban, anti-Al-Qaeda, anti-ISIS, right? Then they've done a lot of the fighting. You may have seen the female fighters being celebrated in your Facebook feed or on the news or elsewhere, and good for them. They are genuinely inspiring. But the West traditionally has supported the Kurds in part because of that, and because they're a genuinely oppressed group. Turkey doesn't like them, and treats them as almost an insurgent group, and treats their militias that they use to fight against Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban and so on, treats them as terrorists. And the Turks are worried about them because this ethnic group crosses the border and they're very active on the border. And so Turkey wants to do an operation against them on their border and through into Syria, which obviously is the current big flashpoint. So Trump has decided to back Turkey in this. This is Erdogan, or is it Erdogan? You know what I mean. Who is a bit of an authoritarian. And given more transcripts have been released recently of Trump kind of cuddling up to the more authoritarian populist right regimes, I guess it's not that surprising that he would be all starry-eyed and uwu towards Erdogan, for whom he's expressed jealousy that he can't just take control in the same way that Erdogan has. But yeah, so we're now backing the Turks against our own allies, the Kurds, in Syria, because Trump. So Turkey's going to be moving into northern Syria. The US is not going to be aiding them, but they're just not going to get in the way in any way, and it looks like it may be removing a lot of support for the Kurds, which is a shame. So Turkey's plan is allegedly to set up a safe zone in northeastern Syria by moving in, and well, things are probably going to get rather horrible there, in the way that they have been for some years now. But I think it just shows how clumsy Trump is when it comes to foreign policy. I think that the reason for what appears to be his success in a lot of these instances is that just he's a bull in a china shop, and I expect a lot of diplomats are going, look, we know he's a pillock, he'll be leaving hopefully very soon, otherwise in about 4 years. All we've got to do is grit our teeth and not let things get too bad until he's out, and then we can get things back to normal and we can start making progress again. That's what I suspect is going on. You know, I expect diplomats with North Korea going, look, this guy's crazy. I mean, you're nuts, but this guy, he's mental. Okay, let's just keep things calm as we can until he's gone and then sort things out. In much more diplomatic language, I'm sure, but still. Plastics. A lot of talk about the environment lately. Unilever, who make things like Surf, the laundry detergent, PG Tips, the tea, and a whole bunch of other things. They're planning to cut their plastics as a way to appeal to Generation Z, or Z for any Americans who might be watching. Not eliminate it, but they're hoping to halve the amount of plastic that they use and to recycle half of whatever remains. Plastic is an issue. I think it's great that it's been highlighted, but why has it become this big avatar thing of action on the environment, right? There's a lot more going on, and yet plastic seems to be the big thing, and has been for some time, but especially lately. Now, we introduced a charge for plastic bags here in the UK. That's actually worked really well. Other states look set to follow. So that's good. Plastic is a wonderful material and it is recyclable, but the recycling rate isn't as high as it should be or could be, really. But why this when it's greenhouse gases that are much more of an issue? I think it's because this is a solvable issue, a soluble issue, and one that's relatively cheap to correct. So I think companies have kind of leapt on this bandwagon because it's a relatively cheap and easy thing to fix, which isn't to say that they shouldn't, but we face bigger, more pressing, more urgent issues than just plastics, and it's not really packaging so much that's the issue, it's the microplastics and that sort of thing. So while I welcome it, I'm cautious. I don't trust it when like one thing becomes the whole big issue, right? Because there's always seems to be a reason why. I mean, some of it's herd behavior and tribalism, but here I think this is because it's easy, and these are things that they could have done years ago, but finally there's commercial pressure coming from the younger generations who are even more eco-aware to do it. So I don't know. I don't trust it. Now there are bioplastics and things that we should be using, things that break down. There's some interesting stuff about clothing on. Is it Click, the BBC sort of technology science internet show about clothing that you can just once it's torn or whatever, you can just bury it in your back garden and it'll decompose in like 3 months. So plastic alternatives and cloth alternatives that we can compost essentially sound like a good idea to me. And we've had alternatives to plastics for a long time. There's a biodegradable plastic alternative made from shrimp shells, which is really good. There's a treatment from farming wastes, so a high cellulose farming waste that we can make that's a biodegradable plastic. We've had that for at least 10 years, but it costs like 1 extra penny a bale or whatever it is, and margins and so on is why they haven't adopted it. So I guess it's good, but I can't help but be suspicious because I'm getting cynical in my old age. Back to Brexit. Johnson says, we can do a deal if the EU is willing. Latin, cui bono, carpe diem, snake, or something. So there's a summit in 11 days' time, but he's planning to prorogue tomorrow, so he might not even be Prime Minister tomorrow. We'll see. I think this is all bluff and bluster, though. He doesn't want a deal. There's been even more revelations about hedge fund involvement and so on over the weekend. I don't know, right? I am into politics. I've studied politics. I've studied history. I'm into history as well. I keep a weather eye on all of this stuff, and I have no idea what's happening. I don't think anyone has any real idea what's happening. I'll get to questions and stuff at the end, as usual, questions and comments. Right. And here is the other problem, right? Tempting and fun as it is to blame everything on Boris Johnson and the Conservative government, I just can't, because it's not just them. Corbyn has been thoroughly useless on the Europe issue since the referendum. And his cult of personality has gradually bled away because it was largely young, radical people who thought he seemed like something great to move into power, right? That's all bleeding away because he's fumbled Europe. So all that momentum, pardon the pun, that Labour had, that Corbyn created, and that necessary correction to the left that he represented, it's all been squandered. It's pointless now. There's a chance of a government of national unity. There's no chance, really, of it forming around Corbyn because he is so desperately unpopular with swathes of his own party, the Liberal Democrats, and the former Conservatives, who are either whipless or have joined the Lib Dems or wherever else. But he's unwilling to step aside. As far as he sees it, I am the leader of the major opposition party. If there is to be a minority government of national unity or whatever, I should be at the head of it come hell or high water. But there isn't the backing there, so it has to be someone else, but him and his supporters will not even entertain the possibility that it could be anyone else. I would prefer Tom Watson. Margaret Beckett has been put forward. I think she'd be okay. Ken Clarke has been put forward. I think he would be a great one to put in. He's like father of the house, the oldest serving member of parliament. He commands a lot of support and respect on the Conservative side of the benches, and a lot of support and respect from the opposition side. I think he would be the perfect one. I mean, he's clearly a man of principle at this point. I may not agree with all of his principles, but by and large, I think he would be the best option. But no. Another suggestion is to put Bercow in. I think that would be very unpopular in the country, but that could work. But no, Corbyn won't step aside. But it's not just Corbyn that's an issue. Jo Swinson, leader of the Liberal Democrats, has been very anti the idea of any alliance, sort of alliance with Labour, to form a government of national unity or to go into coalition with them. I can understand why they might be gun-shy of coalition government, but this isn't helpful, right? We have a singular, very, very pressing issue that needs to be sorted out, and I think you have to put all of these kind of reservations aside to do that. But the opposition will not come together on this, and now the SNP. That's a very roundabout way of getting to the SNP issue, which is what I actually want to talk about. Because up until this point, the SNP has been fairly good on this and not particularly self-serving. I think occupying the moral high ground has been very good for them. Looks like they're going to do very well in any election that does take place. Maybe another clean sweep, or virtually clean sweep in Scotland. But now, they've come out and they said, all right, we'll support an opposition government, but only if we get another referendum on whether Scotland can become independent or not. Now, that couldn't come up in a government of national unity because that's not the issue that it's been formed for, and you wouldn't get unity on that. But they're looking ahead, looking for... It does have implications for that, but they're looking ahead and looking forward to any election and basically offering to go into coalition with Labour if they can get a second independence referendum. Now, if Corbyn did get in, I think he would be up for that. And I can't exactly blame Scotland for wanting to leave. Just please take us with you, those of us who also want to leave and get back into the EU. But it's playing games with the future of the country, and so I do not approve. And this is obviously to try and apply pressure during this moment of crisis as well. It's playing politics with the future of the country at a time when we should be coming together purely to oppose Brexit because it's so obviously a bad and terrible idea. I'm going to skip over that next Brexit story. It's basically a repeat of what I said earlier. Various noises on either side of the divide ahead of any final decisions. So let's leave Brexit behind for a moment. Facebook, if you've been keeping up on it at all, they've been looking for ways to try and get into the whole crypto thing. So they were on about creating their own currency called Libra and a digital wallet called Calibra. On the one hand, having a credible big company behind some kind of crypto alternative could be a good thing because crypto currently lacks stability, credibility, usability, and something like PayPal could change that, and it could solve a lot of international payment issues. So if you had a high uptake form of cryptocurrency that could more easily be transferred, that might solve the issues of people like Naomi Wu, who's been chased from platform to platform to platform. So you might be able to support someone like her using Libra in a way that could be taken up by a lot more people than current cryptocurrency, which I'm not stupid, but I have a very hard time using it or understanding it. I've got a load of Steam, and I don't even know how to transfer it into my wallet or turn it into real money or whatever else. I've got bits and pieces of other crypto that people have given me, and I thought, well, I'll accept it, but So on the one hand, it's good. On the other hand, I don't want a big company like Facebook having even more power, and we'd be talking like PayPal money here rather rapidly, and essentially creating a corporate script, and then that meaning that if you're not on Facebook, you couldn't really use the currency, which is probably what they're aiming for, to increase the amount of uptake of Facebook again and to lock people into using Facebook. That's probably part of what they're thinking of. And then you look at the things like the social credit system in China, and that's hard and imposed, but we already have that in a kind of soft sense. And then if we bring currency into that, that's another issue. So, yeah. But Libra's in trouble. A lot of regulators and governments are going like, no, we don't want you doing that. We can tolerate a small amount of cryptocurrency stuff going on because it doesn't really interface with the economy proper, but we're not keen. And as a result, PayPal, who had been involved in Libra, have pulled out. So Libra's looking less and less likely, though I'm sure Facebook can afford to go ahead anyway. But if governments won't accept it, won't let them use it, and if big backers like PayPal are pulling out, issue. Had enough of that. The centre of the Milky Way exploded 3.5 million years ago. So don't worry, we're probably okay from that, but it suggests that our galaxy is more active than we originally thought. A paralysed man has been able to move around in a mind-reading exoskeleton, which is a really uplifting and heartwarming story, if you want to go and look it up. Kind of shows how technology is moving on leaps and bounds for these things. French researchers did this. A man called Thibault 30-year-old paralyzed man. So what it does is it reads your mind and translates that into movements. He had to have surgery to place 2 implants on the surface of his brain, covering his movement control centers, and then those could detect his thoughts and then move the exoskeleton in the way that he wanted to move. So you can control the arms, the legs, and so on. Took a bit of concentration and obviously an operation. Now, he hasn't always been paralyzed, so I don't know whether that's going to have a huge impact for people who are born with issues like that. He was crippled in an accident about 4 years ago. And basically he's a guinea pig for all this sort of technology. And increasingly, this is what we're seeing, either through nerve induction or brain scanning technology. Facebook are now launching their own sort of mind-reading technology explorations. Elon Musk, obviously, we've talked about before. If they can get rid of the surgery, I think they might be onto something. But I guess for people like him who are severely crippled, operations don't seem like such a big deal. But there are other ways we can deal with this, like there's research into nerve regeneration using stem cells to replace broken nerve endings, spinal columns, and so on. With some success, the real problem isn't the damage per se. We know what's wrong, and we know theoretically how to fix it. The problem is nerve endings are very small, very complicated, and very deep, and there's a lot of problems with repairing them without doing other damage. So if we can find more precise techniques, we may be able to just repair the damage rather than doing big roundabout things like this. But if we can do non-invasive mind-operated controls for exoskeletons, then mecha become possible. So let's see. 2 fungus stories. Citizen science, so sort of mass big data gathering through the public, has helped reveal the secrets of honey fungus. That's the one that spreads out over huge areas. The mycelium spread out all over for miles and miles and miles. And they got a whole bunch of people to report sightings and the surrounding flora and so on. And so they've found out a huge amount about it. Where's the... Okay, so this tells you what... Honey fungus can be quite destructive. So because of this, they found out what plants are a good idea to plant, what plants aren't, if you want to avoid having honey fungus and so on, because it spreads such a long way, and it's become more invasive recently because of our warm, dry summers, which make plants more susceptible to attack by honey fungus. So this is a big colony that can spread over miles and kills a whole bunch of trees, woody plants. And once it gets into your garden, you can manage it, but you can't really eliminate it. And of course, you only see it when you see the fruiting bodies and so on. So, okay. So now we know. So if you're a gardener, I'm not, I just let it go wild as much as possible, because it's good for wildlife. But if you are, go and check it out. Plants in the Myrtalis order of flowering plants, including myrtle and fuchsia, and the ericales, including camellia and heather, are low susceptibility, while those such as liquid amber and witch hazels, birch, sweet chestnut, those are the things that are most highly susceptible. So there you go. And the other fungus news is that there is a deadly fungus that has been found in Australia, surprising absolutely nobody, in the northern parts of Australia, that you so much as touch it and you can get a horrible fungal infection which can shrink your brain and kill you, amongst other issues. So it's not exactly news, but avoid Australia at all costs, as we already knew. And maybe there's a possibility there for a genuine zombie infection. Okay, right, that's pretty much everything. Let's take a look at the comments and questions. Insomnia Jack says, aren't plastic microfibers getting into our drinking water, though? Right. It's plastic microparticles rather than fibers per se. The big problem is these plastic microparticles that are in things like exfoliating soaps and so on. Those really readily enter the food chain and could potentially affect us quite badly because we're relatively high on the food chain because we eat other animals. That's more of an issue. Larger plastics can break down and become microparticles and get into the food chain and into the drinking water and so on as well. But that's less of an issue than these nanoparticles and things. So that's the big issue. Obviously, we should clean things up, and it is a problem, and so on. What I was just trying to get across is, when something like this happens, it's one of those big things that everybody feels that they can do and they can get in on, and then they kind of just do that. And if companies are getting on board, then it can't be that difficult because, you know, legislation hasn't been necessary, which makes you wonder why they weren't already doing it. You know, it's just it stinks a bit, and there are bigger issues. Morning, Ben. Yes, Corbyn collects or at least spots manhole covers. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I pretend to be an elf on weekends, so I don't feel in particular position to judge. But there you go. Manhole covers can, or at risk of alienating you, manhole covers can be interesting because they don't get replaced that often, and there's a lot of old ones from companies and so on that no longer even exist. And I can see how someone who's part of the Labour movement might be into that. Rob says, honestly, at this juncture, it makes sense to have a caretaker government with a neutral, unaligned technocrat leading it. Yeah. But it's selling that to people that's tricky, I think. I mean, 2/3 of people in the country, thereabouts, are against a no-deal Brexit. But of that, some people still want a Brexit, though there is a clear majority, more than the margin of error, in pretty much every poll for at least the last 6 months, is now against Brexit. But if we put in, say, Bercow as a sort of technocratic prime minister to just kind of sort out the mess, I don't think that would go over well with a lot of people, even though they've swallowed Bojo, who isn't elected, being put in charge. He hasn't faced the ballot box as a government, doesn't really have an agenda or anything past Brexit, and they'll happily swallow that. But if they've put in someone else, unelected, particularly someone who seemed to be a Remainer or whatever, I think it would be a hard sell. But yeah. Insomnia Jack says, England leaving the EU bad, Scotland leaving the UK good. Okay, yes. Right. So we're being kind of hornswoggled into leaving the EU under false pretenses, perversion of democracy and everything else. And by leaving, we're doing a huge amount of damage to ourselves as a country, and we're also harming the EU. We're going to lose a whole bunch of rights. That's bad. If Scotland leaves us in the United Kingdom, that would then free them up to rejoin Europe, to regain all those rights, freedom of movement, all the rest of it, and help them to develop and expand their economy once they leave us. So they would genuinely actually stand to gain from leaving the United Kingdom, whereas we stand to lose from leaving Europe. It's two rather different circumstances. Rob says, I don't consider Bercow remotely unaligned. Before he was Speaker, he was very, very conservative. Now, he is what Americans would call a constitutionalist, I think. He's very concerned with parliamentary procedure, Britain's constitution, doing things right. I think he appears to be some sort of arch Remainer to Brexiteers just because he is so insistent that everything be done properly, and they are so insistent that everything be done improperly. So I think he has been one of our great neutral speakers, I think. And he wouldn't be a bad choice. It's just a hard sell, I think. And obviously, me being a lefty, I'm not really on board with a very conservative person being speaker. But there you go. He's no Betty Boothroyd, but close second. Did I hear about the Lamentations of the Flame Princess book getting pulled from drive-thru? Yes, I did. I was possibly going to cover that tomorrow, depending how my schedule ends up being. But yeah, so they did a book that was originally called Zack Has Nothing to Do with This Book, and it's kind of a satire of how Raji has been treated. James Raji from Lamentation of the Flame Princess has been treated by various people, and how suspicions have been cast and so on. It's kind of a paranoid semi-adventure. I find it interesting as an artifact, not necessarily as a piece of game material or a piece of writing or whatever. Now, drive-thru said they would be fine with it being published. Zack genuinely has nothing to do with that book. It's critical of drive-thru and of the witch hunt around Zack. So I don't really understand why they pulled it, especially when they said that they wouldn't, and when Zack has nothing to do with it. It just looks like they've come under a lot of pressure again. Now, Lamentations has always sold a lot of their stuff directly, so I don't think they're going to be too impacted by drive-thru being more interfery and nasty, but we shall see. What's my work schedule like this week? Well, pretty much as soon as I get off this call, I'm in a conference call about trigger warning and some other related projects in the future. Rachel didn't win the transhumanist primary, unfortunately. But on the fortunate side, that means she's now free to do cool stuff, and I'm free to help her, so that's good. So possibly talking over some of that. Schlocktoberfest just means I churn out cheap, barely checked rubbish, sort of throw ideas at the wall and see what happens. So probably more monsters this week, and then I've broken ground on a sort of adventure sourcebook supplement called All Goblins Are Bastards, which will be out some point this month, and people have given me suggestions for other things they want to see. So yeah, I'm kind of rapid prototyping game stuff, which is something I do every couple of Octobers. So that's that. Otherwise, reasonably open. Right, if there's nothing else, I shall get on. Please do remember to subscribe and share and so on. I'm trying to build this channel up. Remember, it's not the same channel as my main channel. This is just for live streams, which has been helping my metrics and subscribers on my other channel. But I need to get this to 100 subs so I can name it. I need to take a quick break before my conference call, so I will see you later. Take care, everyone. Zang, have a good week.